Welcome to Halteres Presents, a brand-agnostic interview podcast that seeks to objectively highlight the happenings within the world of diagnostics. And now, your hosts, Thayer and Mickey Urdea.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Halteres Presents. My name is Thayer, Managing Partner at Halteres Associates.
And this is Mickey Urdea, the founding partner at Halteres.
Today, we are presenting our first ever roundtable discussion to parse through what FDA's recent ruling on laboratory developed tests, or LDTs, could mean for the diagnostics industry.
We're excited to host two people that we know very well. Jen Leib, who is a registered lobbyist in Washington, and Elliot Cowan, a former FDA official. We're all still trying to figure out what all of this means. And it's very interesting to have two people with very different perspectives in our discussion today.
And now, our roundtable discussion with Jen and Elliot. Jennifer, I know you have been on Halteres Presents in the past, having joined us on a two-part series in season 1. And Elliot, this is your first episode with us. A hearty welcome to both of you. Let's start by having you tell us a bit about yourselves. Jen, please.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's always a pleasure to chat with you both. My background, I'm a genetic counselor by training, but I actually left the clinical research field over 20 years ago by working in the Senate on the committee that has jurisdiction over all healthcare policy in the United States called the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. I spent 2 years there and then got recruited off the Hill to work in industry as a lobbyist. And that is what I've been doing since the end of 2005. I've been consulting since 2008. And because of my personal interest in genomics, genetic testing, precision medicine, a lot of the practice of our firm tends to focus on the laboratory diagnostic space.
Great, thank you, Jen. And Elliot?
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be part of this group. So my background is I had spent 10 years at the NIH in a research program, and then moved over to the FDA, where I was for 20 years. I became a branch chief in the Center for Biologics, also called CBER. I was the head of the group that handled all the full-time reviewers for blood donor screening tests and for retroviral diagnostics. After 20 years at the FDA, which included some work with helping WHO put together its pre-qualification diagnostics program, I retired from public service and began to do some consulting work. With the goal of helping companies understand how FDA thinks and to provide some feedback on submissions before they go in. The goal, of course, to improve the submission and minimize the number of comments and certainly any fatal comments that might be in a submission.
Great, thank you. Today, we'd like to explore a topic that is of keen interest to the diagnostics community, namely the future of lab-developed tests, or LDTs, in the United States. Jennifer, to get us started, can you please share with our audience a bit of the history here on LDT regulations and, if possible, summarize the key perspectives of both FDA and the laboratory industry? And what just happened? What's the ruling and what does that mean?
This policy issue, whether or not FDA should regulate laboratory developed tests, or LDTs, has been in the forefront of discussions for over 2 decades. I've at least been working on it since 2003 when I worked in the Senate, and then since then on the other side of the table. It seems like this is the first time in over 2 decades we actually have some very concrete policy in place, which we can talk about in a minute. But leading up to that, there have been efforts over the years by both the executive branch, the FDA, as well as Congress to try to put clarity around how these tests should be regulated. And in fact, you might recall back in 2014, FDA released draft guidance that provided a framework for bringing all of these types of tests into regulatory compliance. That framework was never finalized. Since then, there have been about a dozen different legislative proposals considered from 2005 up till now. One even introduced by then Senator Obama when he was in the Senate, even Senator Ted Kennedy. So big healthcare champions focusing on this issue for over 15 years ago. And then more recently, there's a lot of focus on the VALID Act, which you probably are familiar with, which the reason why that got a lot of attention is it actually had some momentum behind it back in 2022, and it nearly became law before the end of that year. So Congress has been thinking about this for 20 years. FDA has probably been thinking about it for even longer. But this year, the big update is that FDA actually finalized a rule that in essence only added 10 words to existing FDA regulation, which essentially says that even if your test is manufactured, as FDA says, in a laboratory, it is considered a medical device, is considered an IVD, and it is subject to FDA's medical device regulations.
What did they actually rule, and what are the implications?
Yeah, so the final rule is, if you read it, it's quite lengthy, a couple hundred pages plus an economic impact analysis. So it's hundreds of pages of policy, but in essence, what they did is to the existing definition of a in vitro diagnostic product in FDA regulations, they added the following phrase, including when the manufacturer of these products is a laboratory. So those 10 words basically said an in vitro diagnostic device, as defined in FDA regulation, includes when it's developed and validated and performed in a laboratory. So it expands the medical device regulations makes it very clear that FDA expands that to apply to laboratory developed tests or LDTs. The rule also included a phase out of FDA's current enforcement discretion. FDA believes they've had this authority all along since the medical device law was passed in 1976, but that they have been practicing enforcement discretion and not requiring labs to come into compliance with the medical device regulations. So in the final rule, FDA provides a 4-year timeline of them phasing out that enforcement discretion, in which beginning 1 year from when the rule was published, so May 6, 2025 will be the first stage of that phase out. The laboratories will over time have to come into full compliance with FDA's medical device regulations.
Were there any exemptions that people should be aware of?
And I try not to use the word exemption. I know, and I have conversations with labs and clients, and everyone refers to them, but they're actually not exemptions. FDA refers to them as continued areas of enforcement discretion. And I point that out because it's actually quite significant, because that's policy. That can be changed without rulemaking, without public comment. FDA can just decide we're no longer practicing enforcement discretion. So even though the rule did include categories of continued areas of enforcement discretion that a lot of people are referring to as exemptions, I wouldn't rely on those or count on those as being permanent. They are something that could be changed very easily. And in fact, throughout the final rule, FDA does state that if they have concerns about a test or a lab, that they will take regulatory action. So even if you meet one of those categories, they still would intervene.
Thanks for the correction on that.
If I could just add something on to what Jen had mentioned, which was a very nice, concise explanation of what's going on here. What I wanted to mention also is FDA's thinking and why it wanted to do this. It wasn't a power-hungry siege or something like that, but it was very much based on risk, because FDA had been receiving a number of complaints and concerns, and had noted several adverse events that were associated with the LDTs. And FDA, being an agency which operates under the mantle of reducing risks at all, I was going to say at all costs, but that's not a good way to put it. But reducing risk, and of course that the benefits outweigh the risks. So a fair amount of the final rule is dedicated to the rationale that FDA is applying to their actions. So I thought it's important to have that as part of the perspective as well.
Thank you, Elliot. That's very helpful. Elliot, let me ask a follow-on question. One of the attractions of the LDT space is that by having this laboratory testing option, or at least as it's been up till now, it's a way for new advanced diagnostic technologies such as next-generation sequencing and new biomarkers, perhaps for neurodegenerative diseases and others, to reach the clinical setting. If these new guidelines actually stand and go into practice, how do you believe this could impact the development of new innovations in the space and the overall attractiveness of the U.S. market for both innovators and developers?
Rich, of course, it's a very complicated question and really difficult to answer. But the impact of this is that I'm going to go off the question for a minute. The reality is there are thousands, literally thousands of tests that are LDTs. And if FDA is going to move ahead with this, there are some things that are going to happen, which is trying to well, prioritize tests and then also get them through the system. And they are, because of the sheer volume of tests, FDA is going to be under incredible pressure. And I've actually heard some concerns from people who are in the agency about how the logistics of this are going to take place. If a few hundred reviewers are recruited, that's far, far from the number that would be needed, I would expect, for an appropriate review. And by appropriate, I mean not only not missing things, but being overly zealous in their reviews and taking some products off the market. Having said that, because of that extraordinary pressure that's going to be on the agency and on the reviewers, I would expect it's going to be more challenging for new types of products to get through, especially those that show some good promise. Having said that, I mean, there's also the Breakthrough Device Program, which would be able to move products forward that are especially meeting a particular need. But there are just so many moving parts here. It's going to be difficult to see how this is going to play out in terms of FDA's day-to-day business. Does that help to address your question, Rich?
Yes, thank you. It's a crystal ball opportunity for sure.
If I can comment on FDA resources, I share the same concern. And in fact, I really wonder how the agency is planning to address this tremendous increase in workload that it's taking on, and was surprised that in the agency's request to Congress for its fiscal year 25 budget, it did not include a request for additional funds to support the implementation of the final rule. And last week, the House Subcommittee on Appropriations passed the legislation for the next fiscal year for FDA, and actually gave FDA a cut in its budget. So I'm not entirely sure how the agency thinks it's going to be able to shift the resources it needs to meet its current program requirements, plus this new area of regulating LDTs it's taking on. And I know throughout the rule and in public statements, the agency is referred to user fees, but according to the phase out policy, FDA won't actually be collecting those user fees till 3.5 to 4 years from now. And also the user fee renegotiations for the next law is going to be happening at the same time. So to me, it seems like the resource issue is a significant one that stakeholders should be paying attention to, because as you said, it can absolutely affect innovation. And I'll just add that the proposed rule, to me, I was worried that it was going to cause a patient access or testing cliff, that it was going to become finalized and access to testing was just going to come to a halt. But now that there's all the areas of continued enforcement discretion, and specifically everyone's calling it grandfathering, but allowing existing tests to stay on the market, I'm less worried about this testing cliff, but I'm really worried about an innovation cliff 3 to 4 years from now. Because as you said, it's really hard to get investors in tests when it takes multiple years to develop your tests, collect the clinical data, everything, and then submit to FDA. And that may take several years to get through FDA. So the runway to get to market, I think, is longer with this rule. And I do worry about investors and interest in developing new technologies and innovation. So I'm worried about that cliff coming on down the road. And especially when you see like current models of innovation is where labs like Garden or Grail and others launched an LDT while they are submitting and talking to FDA. So I think that pathway is going to go away. So that's how I think of the final rule, and what I'm concerned about is, are we going to face an innovation cliff in precision medicine 4 years from now?
And Jen, there's something else I wanted to add, if I could, and that is the provision for leaving certain tests on the market. There's a catch to that, though, and that is no significant changes, which really means that most changes that are going to be made to these tests will bump it into the area of needing to be reviewed as an LDT, as an IVD. So while that so-called grandfathering sort of an approach will only take people so far because, as we all know, changes are made to tests, and for good reason, to improve performance, to improve access, that sort of thing. So not quite what it would appear when tests are left on the market as a so-called, I'll put it in quotes, exemption.
Yeah, I think that's true for all those exemptions and air quotes. Even the unmet need one. I think a lot of it sounds really good when you read it on its surface, but then when you look at how lab testing and services are provided, they don't really fit. So one example that we've been discussing with congressional offices and talking about the impact of the rule is there's the unmet need if your test is offered at your facility and a credentialed provider is ordering it, then you're allowed to continue to use that test or develop that test if there isn't one available that has the same intended use. But I think of scenarios like the University of Washington, which is in Seattle, and they provide most of the rare disease hereditary testing for patients in Alaska. And those Alaskan providers are not credentialed at the same institution that where the CLIA lab is. And so they would not meet that exemption, to use that word. So I think there was a lot of good intent to try to capture some of the concerns stakeholders submitted in their comments to proposed rule. But in many ways, this softens the blow to patient access, but if they're so narrow or not really practical when you think about how laboratory medicine is practiced and services are provided, that they may not be as effective as the FDA had hoped.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to go back to this issue of innovation for a moment, though, and just talk about the business model, if you will, the way the venture world thinks about this today, and just get any thoughts you have. You know, typically it's been the case that the venture capitalists who are doing early investments are thinking about a particular path to justification and to acceptance of a test. With LDTs, of course, that typically means that some portion of the medical community is taking it on and using it routinely in their practice. And that's bringing in a certain amount of revenue as well. And there's probably some early indication of payment. So that goes away now. And therefore, you've already mentioned that the path, the length of time that's going to be required, but also the amount of money that's going to be required. And unfortunately, on the other end of this is usually the strategic partners who are going to step up at some point, perhaps even turn this into a in vitro kit. But they're waiting for that evidence to occur first before they take it on, because often they're not experts in the field. They're not necessarily well versed in the clinical side of this, which the startups often are. Kind of an interesting scenario there. So, you know, had people thought about this, and has anybody made comments about it, including the venture community?
Yeah, I'll say I haven't seen any specific comments about it. I know a lot of people are thinking about it and having sort of, I wouldn't say, I haven't seen it written in a rule, but I know I've had those conversations with investors and early stage companies about what this will mean as they try to continue to develop their clinical evidence for their new diagnostic. And I think you're right. I mean, I think investors who are already weary, the diagnostic industry is already experiencing some setbacks. And I'm worried that this rule is going to be so significant in terms of not only its burden on existing labs and existing tests financially, but what it will mean for where we were hoping to have stuff on the market or new innovation accessible to patients in the next few years. I really do think it's all going to be delayed, and I don't think there's going to be enough funding for it. So I worry about what that will look like. One of the things too, when Elliot was talking, I was thinking about the FDA's rule is we won't really know what the harm of that is in terms of patient access, because patients don't know what they don't have access to. So if a test wasn't updated to include the latest variant or a cancer panel with the latest gene, patients and their physicians may not know, because that is the latest state of the art. That is what is currently FDA authorized. And so I worry that it'd also be really hard for us to measure what that means for patient and outcomes for patients, because we won't be able to tell, is this test that out of date? Is it 3 years out of date? I think we're not going to have that evidence as well.
It makes perfect sense.
Has there been any extensive discussion about potential solutions to bridge the gap between what's been proposed by the FDA right now and what would be close, but not the same as practice today?
I'm not sure there's been enough time. I mean, something that was remarkable to me is how fast this went from a proposed rule to a final rule. FDA doesn't work like that. Government doesn't work like that. It's crazy. And apparently there were 7,000 comments submitted. And typically, in the course of getting comments on a guidance document or a proposed rule or whatever, it just takes forever. And as reviewers, we knew that because it was like, I put all this work into it, and it's just taking years to get this through the system. But within a few months, it was transformed into a final rule. There's no possible way they could have done what they usually do, which is to acknowledge each of the comments, even putting them together, that there were 750 comments that said X. That sort of, apparently that I can't see how they could have been done.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of concern about whether or not the Administrative Procedures Act was followed correctly or not in the rulemaking process here because of that. It was so expedited. I think most rules take 2 to 3 years at a minimum to go through from proposed till final, and this was 4 months. And even when the comment period on the proposed rule closed, what was it, early December, 3rd or 4th, I can't remember, early December. And that month, FDA announced that in the unified agenda that they planned to finalize the rule by April. So they already knew they were going to do that even before they could have possibly read all the comments. So I was surprised as well.
Maybe we can come back, Jen, to a comment you made a little bit ago, talking about academic medical centers, teaching institutions, stuff, their ability to develop tests where they can offer proof that an LDT is required, tests are being ordered by providers, that sort of thing. Does that potentially set up a bifurcated market for diagnostics where you have integrated delivery networks and academic medical centers, et cetera, able to work within that environment, and other reference laboratories not attached perhaps to as many physician providers or to a hospital network, having a harder time developing or continuing to offer tests that today they are offering? What are your thoughts about that possibility?
I don't know if it'll be bifurcated the way it is now before the rule was finalized with IVDs and LDTs in 2 different categories. But I do think you're going to see a lot of laboratories or diagnostic companies looking at the rule and figuring out, is there a way to maneuver to make sure we have market advantage? And one thing, just given my past work on policy around patient access to genetic testing, I am worried that this may create monopolies for testing. And in particular, that unmet need example. So if there is one lab that got clearance or approval for its LDT, then none of those academic medical centers can develop a test because there is a test that exists that they will have to use. And so it directs all of the sending out of samples to that one test provider in the US. So I do worry that we might see more test monopolies. And what we saw in the past, what that meant for patient access is longer turnaround times, more expensive testing, inability to get a second opinion or confirmatory testing, things like that. And I do worry that might be one of the many unintended consequences of the final rule if it's implemented as it's written.
Well, that's actually a segue into the pushback we're seeing. So that you have, on the one hand, CMS is fully aligned with FDA. It's like, please help us out. And yet, on the other hand, ACLA is filed the lawsuit. So there's some rapid pushback here. And I don't know, I think that's going to slow things down considerably for what FDA is going to be able to do because of these lawsuits and other comments that need to be addressed.
Yeah, when people ask me what I think is, what's the advocacy landscape right now? I see like 4 areas to focus on, and one is litigation. So ACLA filed its lawsuit. Many people think there might be additional lawsuits down the road as well. So will that actually throw out the rule completely? To Congress, I think there's obviously VALID Act and other legislative proposals over the years. So does this create a new urgency or interest among policymakers to pass legislation to pull lab tests out of the device framework? We are running very low on the legislative calendar. So I think that's actually a really challenging thing to do right now in this year. But, it definitely, there is a lot more conversations happening on Capitol Hill. Three, also in Capitol Hill, there's a Congressional Review Act resolution introduced in both the House and Senate. And the Congressional Review Act, or CRA, is a way for Congress to overturn regulations that it doesn't agree with. And, it's a simple majority vote to pass either chamber. However, even if it were to pass both chambers, President Biden most certainly would veto it because it's his administration's policy. So you would actually need a veto-proof majority to avoid that. And I think that's also extremely unlikely to happen. But I think that there's a lot of advocates pushing for that resolution and a vote on it because it's a pretty strong comment from Congress on its viewpoint on the rule. And I think that would be tremendously helpful, and not only for the lawsuit, but other advocacy efforts. And then fourth, it's an election year. We could have a change in administration. Change in administration can change the position on FDA oversight of lab tests. So you might see significant change. And that would require opening rulemaking again. But that's something that's definitely on the table as well.
Wow, thank you for that, Jen. Elliot, it occurs to us that amidst all this turmoil and back and forth in the LDT space, that there may in fact be a bright spot, and that's apparently FDA's increased interest in over-the-counter and at-home testing. So while the laboratories part of the industry maybe has lots of unanswered questions right now, what can you tell us about the opening up of the home testing or OTC market space?
Yeah, I think ultimately is going to be perhaps a disconnect between over-the-counter and LDTs, because LDTs are really out there to meet a specific need. Having said that, though, one of the positive things, if it could be called that, from COVID, is the fact that FDA was shown, and everyone was shown that, gee, people can test themselves and they can do it right, and they can get some reasonable, actionable results from those tests. What a concept! So, but there really hasn't been, certainly for infectious diseases, there has not been an over-the-counter infectious disease test since HIV, the over-the-counter HIV test, which was in 2012. So, doing the math, that's a long time. But there have been discussions about it. But then along comes COVID, and there really were some significant gains to be made. On top of which, I think the public was made acutely aware of IVDs in general. The sorts of things that people really didn't have that much, couldn't feel close to, but because of the over-the-counter tests, it's like, oh, I can test myself, and what we were saying before, that you could get a result that is going to be helpful. So I personally am hopeful rather, that this is going to increase the number of over-the-counter tests, and there are some interesting ones on the horizon in the infectious disease area. I think it makes sense. But the other piece that we're going to contend with here is the new reviewers. These are probably very smart people. They're dedicated to what they do. I have no quibble with that whatsoever. But the idea of what is considered to be an appropriate level of scrutiny, matching with appropriate for what the level of risk is. So it takes a long time to become a reviewer with that sort of a nuanced feel for how to regulate. I put a number on it of at least a year or two to really get to that point. Add on to that what happened with those seasoned reviewers and the people who've been around in the agency for 10, 20 or more years. They left, they retired, because the pressure was just immense during COVID to get tests out the door. They did an incredible job, but losing the institutional memory, I think, is going to be something that we're going to need to contend with, because reviewers maybe, it's interesting. It's not that they're missing things. I think they may, in some cases, they're being overly cautious. And so you tend to see some comments that may have been intercepted, if you will. So it goes both ways, but I guess the short answer is I'm hopeful that that people are going to begin to have access to a battery of tests that will help prevent transmission of infectious disease, certainly, and time will tell.
Thank you. Certainly great food for thought.
Ironically, most of those OTC tests were at one time laboratory tests that went down a path that's no longer open. So it's going to be interesting to see if a new path is created here.
Yeah, there are just so many different moving parts.
Yeah. In the best possible scenario you can think of, how long could it take to resolve this new situation with LDTs? Because that's what the investor is going to be thinking about, and the company is going to be thinking about. And, what's a realistic timeline given things that are going on now?
I think it depends on what your definition of resolve is.
So I guess it would be, we're sure that we're going to go down the path of this rule, and that will be the path forward from this point forward on LDTs, or there will be some give in that might permit earlier sales and evidence in the marketplace.
Well, hearing Elliot's concerns, especially someone who used to be at the agency, so understands how FDA works and how reviewers work and all that, and hearing those concerns, it makes me almost wonder if the dates and timeline in the rule are going to slide a bit too. It's not unusual for regulations to them delay effective dates, delay different aspects of the rule when they take effect, either because of industry's inability to comply or the agency's inability to meet its requirements. So I do wonder if the time frame right now, it's 4 years, that might actually get pushed out further as well, which would also have implications for investors and the way they think about tests. It's hard to predict. You hear a lot of stories about IVD manufacturers taking their products through, or even LDT developers who chose to go through FDA before the rule, and just that it's a multi-year review process. And I do think that in order for FDA to regulate and Concert Genetics, the latest statistics, right? Over 160,000 unique hereditary or cancer tests on the market right now. And that's just genetic tests. It doesn't include infectious disease and non-molecular tests. I don't know how the agency is going to be able to meet this. So I do think there's probably going to be additional policy making where they either shift the timeframes or shift the type of tests that need to come into compliance sooner than others. I don't know what that will look like, but I think there's still quite a bit of uncertainty, even though the rule is finalized.
And if I could just introduce, I guess one way to put it is a global non sequitur to this. If you look at what's going on in Europe with the IVDR, the IVD regulation, they have had to push that multiple times. It was supposed to have been implemented years ago, but it continues to be kicking the can down the road. And one of the roadblocks here is something that is happening at FDA, and that's the number of trained staff. So in Europe, the issue is getting enough of the notified bodies in place, having them certified, and to my knowledge, I'd have to look this up, so the number may not be correct, but you can still count on both your hands how many notified bodies there are that have been authorized by the EU. So if we think in broad terms, it's sort of a recurring theme.
Yeah, that makes
Desire for more regulations, at the same time, more innovations occurring and more tests are available, and the two are at odds.
Jen, Elliot, are there other initiatives being discussed, perhaps in back channels, that could further increase the attractiveness of the U.S. diagnostic market for developers and for innovators? Maybe topics that we haven't talked about yet here today.
Well, and this, Mickey, this is something you and I've talked a lot about over the years, the role of coverage and payment for tests fueling innovation, right? If you're going to develop invest in developing a laboratory developed test or an IVD and you don't have any guarantee of getting coverage and payment at the end, that's a huge disincentive. So I do think there's lots of conversations looking around reforming PAMA and making sure unnecessary cuts to payment don't automatically happen each year. And looking at, also what's happening in the commercial private payer market as well, just to make sure that innovation is covered. I do think that conversation is happening in tandem. Unfortunately, unlike in the drug space, in the diagnostic space, getting FDA authorization doesn't automatically mean you'll be added to a formulary and paid for, right? Labs still then have to lobby payers to get good coverage policies in place and appropriate payment levels for their tests. So I think, that's another concern, but another opportunity for laboratories is to really focus on trying to improve the coverage and reimbursement space.
Jen, certainly it's a very good point. Certainly a lead indicator there oftentimes is CMS and Medicare and what is being authorized for just routine testing, routine coverage there. Are you hearing anything about sort of renewed interest in diagnostics, perhaps for preventive, conditions and preventive testing, where CMS may be taking more of an interest in allowing that type of testing to be more routinely performed?
Yeah, I think with preventative tests, in some ways, CMS hands are tied because they actually need statutory authority to cover screening. So it's not something they can do without a federal law letting them do it. So, a lot of the big categories, there is federal law that says CMS can cover screening for colon cancer, breast cancer, diabetes, et cetera. So there are big categories, but there is legislation pending in Congress to allow CMS to cover tests that are screening for multi-cancer. So screening for multiple types of cancer at once, because that doesn't fall in a colon cancer benefit or a breast cancer benefit, right? It's multi-cancer. So CMS actually needs a federal law that allows it to screen for multiple cancers at once. So it could be liquid biopsy or other technology. And then once they have that authority, then they can put in place the coverage policies behind it. And so that's something, that legislation, I think like 2/3 of the House and Senate are co-sponsors, so it could easily pass in this incredibly partisan environment. But it's a very expensive piece of legislation, so Congress needs to find a way to pay for it. So that's why, despite the support and the acknowledgement that that's where innovation is heading, it's slow to become law. And then separately, the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force can set coverage policies or can set recommendations for screening. And then the Affordable Care Act says that if that task force gives a grade A or B to a recommendation for screening, then payers need to cover it at no cost sharing. So that's the other avenue to get covered for preventive services. And unfortunately, over time, that process hasn't really played out the way I guess it doesn't really match where the standard of care is. And the example I always give is the recommendations for BRCA testing. It's actually open right now. They just initiated the process to update them, but the recommendations don't believe the evidence is there to support offering that testing to men with breast cancer. And as a genetic counselor, I mean, to me, that seems like a high risk group that likely has a mutation, and men should be offered genetic testing for hereditary cancer risk. So despite the evidence and despite that being the standard of care clinically, the Preventive Services Task Force guidelines might not reflect that. So it's challenging to get preventive services covered, for sure. I recently looked at the task force members roster because I was curious, and they are all public health primary care providers. There's not one person who is an oncologist, who is a geneticist, nothing. So they're making recommendations on very complex areas of healthcare, and they don't actually have access to the right experts, subject matter experts. So it's a very frustrating process.
It is. There's been an incredible amount of innovation in the whole CNS field on both the diagnostic side and the therapeutic side. We finally have a few drugs available that actually are disease altering for Alzheimer's, which is astonishing, and more coming along in Parkinson's. And all these are being informed in some way or another by biomarkers, sometimes for screening. More often than not, more recently is diagnostic, where it actually can do a better job than imaging or equivalent. And what happens in a situation like this where the innovation in treatment is held up by the availability of tests?
So the treatment's available, but the test is not? Is that what you're asking, or?
Right now, they're in an LDT format, and they're being used in that way by physicians. It will take time. Some of them are before the FDA now, but that would have held up much of the work that's gone on to date without having access to an LDT.
So that makes me think of a real example of Sarepta's gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, because they had a companion diagnostic. It was a companion product, right? So it was both CDRH and CBER, Biologic Center. And the test was actually to see if the boys had already been exposed to the viral vector that they were using, because if so, then they would not respond. They were immune, they would not respond to the gene therapy. And their authorization was getting held up because of the test. The CDRH work was not done. And so finally, CBER authorized a gene therapy to make it available for these young men with a terminal disease. But they're using an LDT in the interim to select men for the therapy, because the IVD is still yet, at least I'm not, as far as I know, is still yet to be authorized by the agency. I don't know if it has in the last 6 months or so. So I do think that is a very realistic issue that we're already seeing before the rule was finalized is a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
If I could put my FDA hat on for a minute, the first question I have is, how good are the data? Because there are so many people that claim this is it. We have a biomarker and it detects 95% specificity and 99% sensitivity and that sort of thing, only to find out later that the study is biased. The study wasn't done properly. So I'm with everyone in terms of excitement, that, gee, it sounds like this is going to work, but I just need to see, not me personally, of course, but the agency needs to see the data. I mean, this sounds like it's a perfect candidate for, granted it's an LDT, but if it does go through what FDA is asking it to go through, it's a prime candidate for a breakthrough device. And what that gets you is, number one, bragging rights, but number two, very scripted interactions with FDA to move this through, because there's nothing that FDA likes better than saying it just approved or cleared or de novoed the first fill in the blank. They love the publicity, and rightly so. I mean, that's what they're there for, is to have good products on the market. So we have competing factors here, which are not only the regulatory side, but also the biological side. How good, again, are the data that you're getting excited about? It could work. It could be fantastic. I'm not arguing with that. You just have to take that step back and look at it very objectively and get those studies done appropriately, without being too burdensome, by the way. Yeah.
We agree with you completely. That makes all the sense in the world. And I think a couple of markers which are going down this path now are p-tau 181, which did get breakthrough status with the FDA, and p-tau 217, which even looks more exciting in terms of its potential, with a number of very good publications out there. I'm not aware that that's gotten breakthrough status yet, but won't be surprised if it does. So that there, in this case with the CNS, there are a couple of examples where that is happening.
And I'm curious too how the rule would affect that, because stage 2 of the phase out of the enforcement discretion is does mandate that investigational device exemptions be pursued if you're using an LDT in a clinical trial. So if you're using it to select patients for a therapy in a trial, then I think 2 years from the publication of the rule, so May 6, 2026, you're going to have to pursue an IDE in order to even study that in a clinical trial.
Right.
On a positive note, the FDA did announce in January, that they were going to reclassify a lot of their tests based on, reclassify them based on risk. And one of the areas in which they said they were going to down classify tests was companion diagnostics. So perhaps a lot of those would be moved out of the highest risk PMA to a de novo or 510K category.
That's great. We've talked a lot about the people who have possibility of losing something as a result of this change. Who are the parties, who are the stakeholders that might benefit from it and how?
Well, if you ask FDA, it would be the public because of their concern about risk and people being injured as adverse events associated with tests that haven't been validated appropriately.
I agree. I mean, that's FDA's perspective. I'm not sure the rule adequately provided evidence that there really is a harm to public health happening right now that warranted the rule, but that is their argument.
Yeah, there's some differences of opinion there.
Do you think perhaps manufacturers of diagnostic products benefit because it has to go down the path they're accustomed to as opposed to laboratories?
I don't think so, actually. I think I joke that over 20 years of working on this policy issue, I joke this is the first time something has actually unified the laboratory space, and that is the FDA rule. No one was happy with it. So at least that's my perception of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, the device manufacturers were more interested in a legislative fix because the device pathway is not working for them either. So one, Valid Act address their competition issue of requiring LDTs to come into compliance and be subject to the same regulations that they are. But it also addressed a lot of their concerns with the device pathway by creating a new regulatory pathway. So from the manufacturer perspective, that was the win-win. Now it's, I think it's a challenge for them because it didn't improve what their pain points were. But also a lot of their sales, a lot of their revenue is actually labs modifying their IVD test kits and converting them to LDTs. And that can't happen easily anymore, whether it's for sample type or to swap out a reagent, whatever their case may be, they can't do that with the rules. So I think, I think manufacturers they haven't been very vocal in their opposition, but I do think there's a lot of concerns there about the rule didn't address what their pain points were and why they supported Valid Act, and in essence may actually harm their sales for labs that were modifying their kits as well.
Yeah, it makes me think about Roche and Foundation Medicine and the fact that they really are taking what are laboratory tests through a 510(k) process, and that's working pretty well for them.
There's another area that is wrapped up in this, and that's specimen collection systems. It used to be that those were not looked at very closely necessarily, but the way FDA is getting around it, so specimen collection for LDTs. But the way FDA is looking at that now is that the specimen collection system, so if you're going to collect the specimen yourself and mail it in, is viewed as a system as a whole. And the specimen collection is simply a component of that test system, which involves both the specimen collection part and the testing part. So the way FDA has kind of gotten around the LDT thing up to this point is to say, we need to regulate the specimen collection system. So that's just something that FDA is involved with now. And then also not only the specimen collection, but tying it to a specific test to make it a whole test system. So those are just some of the things that have been going on relatively recently.
Elliot, that's really significant. There was a footnote in the final rule about the collection kit. It didn't make it into the actual text with the footnote, but that was actually really significant in terms of concern that FDA might create another barrier by requiring a saliva kit to be authorized for a specific test intended use, and what kind of level of review and resources and that would. And the FDA law blog actually had a great post on that about this tiny footnote might have been one of the most significant lines in the entire rule.
It is important, of course, because it works with whole blood doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work with saliva collection and that sort of thing. So you have to show that specimen collection the issue has been addressed, but just the concept of whole test system as opposed to an individual component.
So the number of the companies that are developing these so-called microsampling devices,
Mhm.
like Tasso, YourBio, and others, they are, of course, going to the FDA, and they've gotten limited claims there. But at the same time, they're working with the Quests and the LabCorps of the world to validate that in an LDT format.
Mhm.
So based on this, where is that going to go, do you think?
It's possible FDA is going to say we need to regulate that sample collection system.
Yeah.
So no longer will they be allowed, the company who makes the test, the collection system will be able just to mail it in to just to have it used clinically through the LDT, but to say what FDA would say, hold on, we have to regulate this. And it's in the context of a series of blood chemistry tests, or whatever the analyte might be, A1C or cholesterol, whatever.
It does seem to be that in the cases of the laboratories working with these companies with these devices, they are focusing on specific tests one at a time.
Yeah, specific analytes. Yeah.
So specific analytes, yes.
But the FDA will allow multi-analyte detection or use in multi-analyte tests, so that the if somebody wants to get cleared for blood chemistries, then there's a certain number of samples you need to use for each of the different blood chemistry elements or analytes.
Right.
Yeah, it's something else that can be thrown back at FDA, by the way, and the whole process here is least burdensome, and make sure that FDA is actually following those principles. So I'm sure that's gonna come up if it hasn't already.
Very interesting.
Don't get much bigger than this. I mean, well, you could, of course, but in the regulatory world, this is serious stuff.
It's been great to have both of you on because you have very different but complementary perspectives, which is what we were hoping for. So this has really gone very nicely.
Something else we didn't talk about, and I don't know that we want to talk about, is cost stuff. Because FDA has a fair amount, and my eyes glaze over when I read these sorts of things. But the argument is it more cost effective what they're going to? Is it less cost effective? And they try to throw numbers around that are in the billions of dollars, and who does that apply to, and things like that.
We dived into the numbers and the economic analysis from the perspective of how feasible is the final rule. The proposed rule, we focus more on whether or not that justification is there that you just referred to. But in the final rule, we did look at that. And one of the numbers that stood out to us is that FDA in the final rule says that it would cost on average $4.3 million for one PMA submission. And we then, if you look at the number of labs, FDA also says there's about 1,100 laboratories in there, more like 1,200, laboratories in the US that'll be affected by the rule. And 800 of them are considered small businesses that do not have annual revenue of $4 million. So just looking at that simple math, how most labs will comply with this rule is not feasible. They don't have the resources. And so expecting consolidation of not only test menus, but laboratories as well as the phase out happens over the next 4 years. And also, whether or not those numbers are low and underestimates. Stanford University did a study, and it's an old study. It's like 15 years old, but with inflation, it's actually more worrisome because they said a PMA costs $75 million for IVD manufacturers is what they found. So, so 74 million versus 4 million, or 75 million versus 4 million plus. I mean, I don't know what the right number is and realistically, but I think it's going to be incredibly resource intensive and expensive for laboratories to comply. And I don't think a lot of them will. And then that gets back to my bigger concern is, when will we really see the downstream effects of this rule? And, how do we measure that? So, is there going to be a harm to public health because of not having adequate access to testing or delayed access? So if only reference labs, large national labs can afford to comply with the rule. So now an academic medical center or a rural community hospital has to send a sample out to that lab. How many days or weeks delay and turnaround time are we going to experience, and how does that affect patients' health and outcomes? And a lot of that discussion and data was missing from the cost analysis in the rule, in my opinion.
Yeah, the whole loss to follow-up challenge.
Loss to follow-up, the benefit of being able to test someone in front of you so you can get them into treatment immediately in the infectious disease space is huge. But also just thinking about the effect on underserved communities, I think this rule is going to definitely delay some access to care there.
Yeah. The wealthy are going to fly to other countries to be seen. We see that in other smaller countries as well. That it's just tragic.
Yeah.
Leave
Yeah.
the unserved.
Well, and I just want to know how we're going to measure that too. That's what I worry about is, will patients know that, okay, I should have gotten this result in 24 hours as opposed to 2 weeks? And will their providers and physicians know as well? And how did that affect their delay, their access to cancer treatment? How do you quantify and measure all these outcomes? And I'm not sure you can. And so, there'll be a lot of talking points on both sides where the agency is saying we've prevented all these bad tests from harming patients beyond the market. And then are we going to be able to really show what the harm was on the other side? Whereas there were delays in access to care. Tests were not modified within years because they had to submit an application to FDA. So like a hereditary cancer panel didn't have new genes added on for 4 years. And so did that cancer go undetected, that risk go undetected, and then subsequent cancer screening not happen? I think it's really hard to quantify what the potential outcome of this rule will be, but those are some of the things that I worry about.
Do you think it'd be possible to actually measure increased morbidity and mortality in disease states where the significant tests have been removed over time?
Perhaps, yeah.
Which would be tragic.
And then you have FDA's commitment to diversity, which is at odds with what's going on here.
Yeah. And on that happy note,
you asked.
Yes.
Well, it's a rough time. Things go in waves with diagnostics, and they're really long waves from, investor interest perspective, without which, the industry can't really survive because the margins are typically so thin. Coming out of the pandemic, Jen, right? Already the manufacturers were in trouble and Wall Street's not happy with stock performance, et cetera. Elliot, you mentioned the IVD revised regulations in Europe, a big pall of uncertainty as to, what's going to happen to bring new products. LMIC market settings, really still haven't emerged. So, where does one go? Where does one go for some sort of certainty around business planning and, revenue opportunities right now in the industry? It's going to be a challenge.
It reminds me of the old joke I've heard applied to the wine industry that I think is appropriate here. How do you make a small fortune in the diagnostics industry? You spend a large fortune. And unfortunately, we're looking at that right now here.
So, Jen, in this current period of uncertainty, which we're seeing now in the United States with, complex diagnostics and LDTs, Elliot, you mentioned already the revised IVD regulations in Europe. The issues in the LMIC, low middle income country markets yet are still up in the air. What would be for you a good metric or measure of more certainty, more, something coming in now to the US space that investors and developers could look at as a ray of hope?
That's a tough question.
I'm imagining just simply postponing implementation, of regulations isn't going to do it because that uncertainty is still there for some years. It'd have to be more of a definitive action, I should think.
I mean, yeah, what would have been nice I guess the lawsuit if ACLA had asked for an injunction, a preliminary injunction to stop the rule, but they didn't. And so, because then you at least know, okay, I don't have to spend all my resources coming into compliance, and then 3 years from now, the Supreme Court throws out the rule, which could happen, right? So labs had invested a lot of resources that they didn't need to do. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. I'm not sure we're going to get more certainty in the regulatory space in the near term. Unfortunately, it probably is better for laboratories to focus on the areas they can influence more right now, whether it's reimbursement policy, getting another extension to PAMA, delaying the the effective dates in PAMA again. Making sure the telehealth extension does not include any restrictions on using telehealth for lab tests. I think those are the areas where there's still active areas of conversation happening in Washington that can easily be influenced. But the LDT space, I think at this point, unfortunately, the lawsuit's probably going to be the most influential one, short of whatever happens in November at the election. But that takes time. Lawsuits, there could be appeals, right? Things take a while, and again, the change in administration could affect an appeal as well, right? So if FDA loses at the district court and there's a different White House, they may not appeal and it could stand. And so there's so many variables up in the air right now that it's really hard to figure out where there's certainty. But I will say this, I do think it's worth engaging. I don't want to say just, well, there's nothing you can do. I think that, Thursday, participating in an advocacy day meeting with well over 100 congressional offices on this very issue. I think it's important to engage policymakers and make sure they're aware of the concerns with the final rule, because that then encourages Congress to take action, do more, and it will also influence how FDA implements the rule. If they're hearing there's significant concerns, or if they're experiencing resource issues, things could get delayed. So I still think it's very much worthwhile to engage in Washington and policymakers on this, despite us having what seems like it's going to be a negative sounding podcast. I definitely think it's still worthwhile to engage and encourage everyone listening to do so. Otherwise, people are going to be making decisions that affect you, and you didn't have a say in it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, Jen.
So what would you advise startups today, or companies today, that one, have an LDT on the market and are doing well with it, or two, we're planning on going down that route, but have to now consider other alternatives? What should they think about? How should they think about all this?
Well, if you're an LDT on the market prior to May 6th, then, or you have New York State approval, then you're in great shape. And I think as long as you don't need to modify your LDT significantly, then the good news is you can continue to offer it as you currently do. So that's great news.
Yeah.
If you're developing a new LDT, I mean, one thing I keep telling people who ask me, one thing I've noticed, right? So here's an entire sector of our healthcare system that has never engaged with FDA before and are not familiar with the medical device regulations, and they're terrified. Right? They don't quite understand what this means practically for them and what they actually have to do to comply with each of the stages. And so I've been really encouraging people to reach out to regulatory counsel, to a certified regulatory affairs expert. There is an association for everything, and there's one for regulatory affairs professionals too, to accredit them and get a real understanding of what it means to register and list, what it means to put medical device reporting requirements in place, all of those things, so that you have a good understanding of what compliance means for your existing tests. And then for the ones as you develop them, what kind of evidence you need to be generating to meet FDA's safety and effectiveness standards. So just thinking proactively about how the medical device regulations are going to change the way in which you develop diagnostics.
That's very helpful.
And there are some things, many things, in what people are expected to do to comply within the next few years that you really should have in place anyway, because you really run the risk of something going wrong and you're not being able to address it, or just passing off complaints and not following up on them. Things like that are just they're warning signals that something's going wrong. So again, they're pieces of a quality system which really do need to be in place, no matter if you're regulated by FDA or not.
And I think some of those things are in place with CLIA, right? CLIA has some adverse event reporting requirements. There's inspections. So some stuff will feel very familiar to laboratories, but is it the same manner in which CLIA operates, FDA operates? So I'm sure there's definitely going to be some duplication, and some overlap, but in many instances not. So just being familiar with regulations.
Yeah, it's my understanding is the CMS, except for New York, the inspections done by CMS by CLIA are not as rigorous. That could be due to just the sheer volume of work that a limited workforce has. It could be what they're using as their base for training people to go in and do. That I just don't know.
Yeah.
I hear that a lot, but I always like to point out that FDA inspection did not stop Theranos, but CLIA inspection did. So
That's great.
Yeah. So it was CLIA that shut down Theranos. FDA authorized Theranos's test for HSV.
That's fascinating.
Well, I can say it's touche.
Thank you both. This has been extremely interesting conversation.
Yeah, truly.
Thank you for allowing me to participate, and this was great talking with all of you.
Halteres Presents is produced by Halteres Associates, a US-based bioscience consultancy that provides strategic and tactical services in the areas of diagnostics, medical devices, and life science research to clients of all sizes. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the episode are solely those of the individuals involved, and Halteres Associates is not responsible for any errors or omissions, or for the results obtained from the use of this information. The information provided in this episode is for informational or educational purposes only, and is not intended or implied to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Halteres Associates would like to say thank you to this episode's guest or guests, and thank you for listening to this episode of Halteres Presents.